The stone is still warm from the mason's hands. Winter 1746. In the Scottish Highlands, a tower rises from bedrock that has held clan chiefs for 400 years. Inside, a woman in silk watches from a window as redcoats move through the glen below. Her husband rode out 3 days ago. He has not returned. The English are coming, not to negotiate, to erase. This castle will stand. The clan will not. By spring, the stones will run with blood. The tartans will be illegal. The language will be forbidden. Children will forget their own names. And across Scotland, an entire way of life complex, ancient, vibrant, will be systematically dismantled by soldiers carrying orders signed in London. The tour guides call it history. They do not call it what it was: cultural annihilation, state-sponsored terror, ethnic cleansing in all but name. This is the shocking truth behind Scotland's lost clans. Not a romantic tragedy, a deliberate campaign. And the scars are still visible if you know where to look. This is the story of Scotland's Highland clans, not the version sold on shortbread tins or performed for tourists in Edinburgh. The real story, the one written in burned cottages and mass graves and shipping manifests that list human beings like cargo, stand today in Glencoe. The mountains rise on both sides, snow-touched even in summer. A stream cuts through the valley floor. It looks peaceful. On February 13, 1692, it ran red. Soldiers billeted in clan homes, fed at clan tables, trusted as guests rose before dawn and began killing. Men, women, children. The orders were specific: total extermination. Weather and terrain saved some, not many. Or visit Culloden Moor, a flat stretch of boggy ground east of Inverness. April 16, 1746. The last pitched battle was fought on British soil. It lasted less than an hour. Jacobite forces, mostly Highland clansmen fighting for their autonomy and their prince, were slaughtered by disciplined government artillery and musket fire. What followed was worse. The wounded were executed where they lay. Survivors were hunted. Homes were torched. Livestock slaughtered. Entire communities scattered. The clans were not defeated in battle. They were destroyed by policy. But before we understand how they fell, we have to understand what they were. The clan system was not primitive tribalism, though that is how it was painted by lowland Scots and English alike. It was a sophisticated social structure, a political organization, a way of binding people to land and to each other through kinship, real or adopted. Chiefs were not absolute monarchs. They led with consent. They owed protection. They held land in trust for the people, not as personal property to dispose of at will. The clans built towers and castles, some crude, some architecturally remarkable. They developed legal codes. They created poetry, music, genealogies that stretched back centuries. They survived in a landscape that did not forgive weakness. And they stood for a long time as a challenge to centralizing state power. That challenge could not be tolerated. This is a story about culture and violence, about how governments erase people, about what gets remembered and what gets buried, about towers that still stand while the voices that filled them have gone silent. This is the shocking truth behind Scotland's lost clans. The Highlands were never empty. That is the first lie. When lowland writers described the region as barren, lawless, barbaric, they were preparing the ground for what would come. The clans had lived in these glens for centuries. They grew oats and barley on thin soil. They grazed cattle and sheep on high pastures. They traded, sometimes raided, and settled disputes through systems of custom and kinship law that predated written statutes. The chief was central, yes, but the relationship was reciprocal. He was protected. The clan sustained him. Land was communal, worked in strips, shared in complex rotations. This was not feudalism in the English sense. It was older, strange, and to outsiders deeply threatening. To understand why the clans had to be destroyed, you have to understand what they represented. Not chaos, but an alternative order. The clan system bound people through real or fictive kinship. If you bore the name MacLeod or MacDonald or Cameron, you belonged. The chief was literally the father of the clan, and that metaphor carried legal and social weight. He judged disputes. He led in war. He redistributed wealth cattle, land use rights, protection downward through a network of tacksmen, essentially sub-chiefs or loyal relatives who managed portions of clan territory. This was not primitive. It was sophisticated, adapted over centuries to Highland geography and economy. The mountains made centralized control difficult. Glens were isolated. Winter closed passes for months. Communities had to be self-sufficient, and kinship provided the glue that formal law could not. When a MacGregor was wronged, the clan responded. When a Campbell needed fighters, the clan mustered. Identity was corporate, not individual. You were never just yourself. You were your name, your people, your land. From Edinburgh and London, this looked like anarchy. Worse, it looked like a rival power structure. Kings claimed sovereignty, but in the Highlands, the chief's word often mattered more than the king's writ. Taxes went uncollected. Royal commands were ignored. And when political crisis came, when the Stuart kings fell and the Hanoverians rose, the clans became a military threat. Not because they were inherently rebellious, but because their loyalty was local, not national. They could be mobilized. They had fought for centuries. And they did not recognize authority simply because it claimed divine right or parliamentary approval. The response was to frame them as savages. Clan warfare became barbarism. Gaelic became the language of backwardness. Highland dress became the costume of primitives. This was not accidental. It was propaganda, a necessary precursor to what followed. You cannot justify erasing a culture unless you first convince yourself and others that the culture deserves erasure. That it is not really a culture at all, just violence and superstition dressed up in tartan. The Highlanders knew what was happening. They could see the pressure building, laws restricting their movement, regulations limiting their trade, missionaries arriving to civilize them, meaning to strip them of language and custom, but they were divided. Some chiefs sought accommodation, sending sons to Edinburgh for education, learning English, adopting lowland dress. Others resisted. And when the crisis came, when the clans were called to choose sides in a dynastic struggle they had not started, the divisions proved fatal. The castles rose where they had to, not on flat ground where armies could deploy with ease, but on crags, on islands in lochs, on hilltops that commanded valley approaches. These were defensive structures first, status symbols second. Tower houses vertical, compact, designed to shelter a clan chief and his immediate retainers during raids or feuds. Walls 3 feet thick, spiral stairs turning clockwise so a right-handed defender descending had the advantage. Narrow windows for arrows, not light. Dunvegan on sky. Eilean Donan on Loch Duwich. Corridor south of Inverness. Each one told the same story. We are here, we are staying, and we will fight to remain. The architecture was dictated by threat and terrain. A Highland tower typically rose 4 or 5 stories. The ground floor held storage salted meat, oats, ale, weapons. Above that, a hall for gathering, eating, conducting clan business. Higher still, private chambers for the chief and his family. At the top, a wall walk and sometimes a calf house, a small projecting structure where guards could watch approaches in all directions. Entry was deliberately difficult. The main door, always on the first floor or higher, was reached by removable wooden stairs or ladders. Once inside, attackers faced the spiral stair, turning upward in a tight clockwise coil. A defender coming down could swing a sword freely with his right hand. An attacker climbing had his sword arm against the central newel post, cramped, restricted. Every design choice was tactical. Materials came from the land. Stone quarried nearby, sometimes blasted from the bedrock the tower stood on. Lime for mortar, burned in local kilns. Timber for roof beams and floors taken from the remnants of the Caledonian forest that once covered the Highlands. Labor was communal. When a chief decided to build or expand, the clan provided hands. Stonemasons might be imported for specialized work-vaulted ceilings, decorative corbels, but most construction was local knowledge, passed down through generations. Inside, life was harsh by modern standards, but not by those of the era. Fires burned in massive hearths. Smoke found its way out through vents or simply through gaps in the roof. Floors were flagstone on lower levels, timber above. Furniture was minimal and portable, trestle tables, benches, beds that could be disassembled. The hall served multiple functions: courtroom, feast hall, sleeping space for retainers. Privacy was rare and largely irrelevant, but these towers were more than shelters. They were symbols. A chief who could raise a stone tower and hold it against rivals was proving his clan's strength. The tower said, "We control this land. We have the resources to build. We have the men to defend. Challenge us at your peril." Some of these castles grew over centuries, wings added, courtyards enclosed. What began as a single defensive tower became a complex, a small fortified village in stone. Others stayed stark and simple, their function never changing because the threat never eased. By the 18th century, many were already obsolete. Gunpowder had changed warfare. Cannon could reduce stone walls. But the clans kept building, kept repairing, kept occupying these structures because they were more than military installations. They were identity made tangible. To abandon the tower was to admit defeat. To lose it was to lose legitimacy. And when the government came with soldiers and policy, the towers were the first targets. Not always destroyed stone is expensive to demolish, but seized, garrisoned, repurposed. Turned into barracks or storehouses or left to decay as warnings, the message was clear. Your castles cannot save you. Your walls mean nothing. Submit or be erased. Gaelic was not dying naturally. It was being killed. By 1600, the language was already under pressure. Lowland Scots spoke Scots, a Germanic tongue closer to English. Highlanders spoke Gaelic, a Celtic language with roots running to Ireland and back to the ancient Britons. This linguistic divide became a political weapon. Gaelic speakers were framed as foreign, backward, incapable of civilization. Laws were passed requiring chiefs to send sons to lowland schools where Gaelic was forbidden. The English could not control what they could not understand, so they set out to make understanding unnecessary. Erase the language, erase the culture. Simple, brutal, effective. The Statutes of Iona, enacted in 1609, formalized the assault. Chiefs were summoned to the island of Iona and forced to agree to a series of terms. Their eldest sons had to be educated in lowland schools, in English. Bards, the traditional poets and historians who preserved clan genealogies and stories, were to be expelled. Gaelic was to be discouraged in favor of English. The goal was explicit: extinguish the cultural practices that made the Highlands distinct. For a chief, this created an impossible bind: refuse, and you risked forfeiting your lands and titles. Comply, and you betrayed the people you were supposed to protect. Many chose survival. Sons were sent south. They returned fluent in English, dressed in lowland fashion, embarrassed by their own origins. Within a generation, the chiefly class began to split from the people they led. The chiefs spoke English. The common clanspeople spoke Gaelic. The bond that had held the system together, shared language, shared identity, began to fray. Gaelic itself was rich and complex. It carried centuries of oral tradition. Poems that recounted battles and genealogies, songs that marked seasons and life events, proverbs that encoded legal principles and social expectations. When you killed the language, you killed all of that. Not immediately, but inevitably. Children who did not learn Gaelic could not access their own history. Stories vanished. Songs were forgotten. Legal concepts that existed only in Gaelic had no translation, and so ceased to exist in practice. The assault on Gaelic was not unique to the Highlands. It was part of a broader pattern of cultural imperialism. The English did it in Ireland, in Wales, in Cornwall. The logic was always the same. Unity requires uniformity. Difference breeds dissent. Erase the language, and you erase the basis for resistance. Religious policy reinforced linguistic erasure. After the Reformation, the Church became a tool of Anglicization. Bibles were printed in English, not Gaelic. Ministers preached in English. Schools, where they existed, taught in English. To be literate was to abandon Gaelic. To remain Gaelic was to remain illiterate and therefore backward. By 1700, Gaelic had retreated to the most remote glens. It survived in the mouths of the old and the poor. It clung to the margins. The educated, the ambitious, the upwardly mobile spoke English. The division was complete. Language had become class, and class had become destiny. The government knew what it was doing. Correspondence between officials is explicit. Destroy the language, and you destroy the identity. Make them speak like us, and eventually they will think like us. The clans will dissolve, the Highlands will be pacified, and Scotland will become governable as a single, unified entity. It worked, not overnight but steadily. Each generation spoke less Gaelic than the one before, and with each generation the memory of what had been lost grew fainter. February 1692. The order came from Edinburgh, signed by men who had never set foot in the Highlands. The MacDonalds of Glencoe had been slow deliberately. Some said to swear allegiance to the new king, William of Orange. The delay gave the government an excuse. Soldiers of the Earl of Argyll's regiment, many of them Campbells, traditional enemies of the MacDonalds, were billeted with the clan. For 12 days they were fed, sheltered, treated as guests. On the 13th night at 5 in the morning they received orders. Kill everyone under 70. Burn the houses. Slaughter the livestock. 38 MacDonalds died in the initial assault. More fled into the February mountains and froze. The massacre was small in scale but massive in symbolism. The laws of hospitality, sacred across Celtic Europe, had been violated by government command. The setup was deliberate. The government wanted the MacDonalds punished, not just for their late oath, but as an example. The Highlands needed to understand that defiance would not be tolerated, but a straightforward military assault would have allowed the clan to scatter into the hills. They knew the terrain. They could vanish. So another method was chosen. Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon led the soldiers. He was related to the MacDonalds by marriage. His niece had married into the clan. He arrived with approximately 120 men on February 1st and asked for shelter. By Highland custom, hospitality was absolute. Even enemies once hosted were under protection. The MacDonalds fed them, gave them quarters, shared whiskey. The soldiers played cards with their hosts. They danced. They ate at the same tables. On the night of February 12th, Campbell received written orders. The language was clinical. The execution was intimate. Soldiers rose before dawn and moved through the houses where they had been sleeping. They shot men as they climbed from their beds. They bayoneted anyone who resisted. Alistair MacIan, the clan chief, was shot in the back while rising to greet the soldiers. His wife was stripped naked, and her rings torn from her fingers with such force that it tore the flesh. She died the next day of exposure. The killing was efficient but not complete. The February weather was brutal. Snow lay deep. Survivors fled into the mountains wearing whatever they had slept in. Many froze before they reached shelter. Children died in their mothers' arms. The elderly collapsed in the snow. Estimates suggest that as many died from exposure as from violence. Livestock were driven off or slaughtered. Houses were torched. The government wanted the glen emptied, the clan destroyed so thoroughly that it could never recover. In that, they failed. The MacDonalds survived, scattered, diminished, but not erased. Yet the massacre achieved its symbolic purpose. It sent a message to every other clan. Loyalty to the crown is not optional. Hospitality will not protect you. The old rules are void. The outcry was immediate and genuine. Even by the standards of the time, Glencoe was shocking. Not because of the death toll, which was modest compared to other atrocities, but because of the method. Soldiers had accepted hospitality and then murdered their hosts. The violation of trust was condemned across Scotland and England. An official inquiry followed. It found that the massacre had been carried out under government orders, but the officials responsible faced no real consequences. The Secretary of State resigned. No one was prosecuted. Glencoe became legend. Songs were written. Poems commemorated the dead. The glen itself became haunted ground, avoided by travelers who believed the ghosts of the murdered walked there still. The massacre entered the collective memory not as policy, but as betrayal. A moment when the government revealed its true face. and the message was clear. The clans existed at the sufferance of the state. That sufferance could be withdrawn at any moment, and when it was, no custom, no law, no bond of kinship or hospitality would matter. The clans did not rise for abstract principles. They rose because their world was already under siege. The Jacobite cause the attempt to restore the Catholic Stuart line to the British throne gave them a focus, a figurehead, a chance to push back against encroaching Hanoverian control. In 1715, the rising sputtered. In 1719, a smaller attempt collapsed. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed in Scotland and raised his standard at Glenfinnan. Clans joined him, not all, not even most. The Highlands were divided. Some chiefs saw opportunity, others saw suicide. The army marched south, took Edinburgh, pushed into England, then turned back. Supplies were thin. English support never materialized. The retreat northward was slow, contested, bitter. Charles Edward Stuart was 24 when he landed on the west coast of Scotland in July 1745. He came with 7 companions, no army, and a delusional confidence that Scotland would rise for him. He was charming, spoke multiple languages, and understood almost nothing about the Highlands he was asking to bleed for him. But he offered something the clans desperately needed, a cause. The Hanoverian government had been tightening control for decades. The disarming acts after the 1719 Rising had confiscated weapons. Economic policies favored lowland trade. The clan chiefs were being converted into landlords, their ancient role as protectors eroded by law and debt. Charles represented a return to older arrangements, or so it seemed. The Stuarts had historically been more tolerant of Highland autonomy. A Stuart restoration might mean the end of Hanoverian interference. The decision to join was agonizing for many chiefs. Clan Cameron came out early. MacDonald of Clanranel joined. MacLeod and MacDonald of Sleat, 2 of the most powerful chiefs, refused. Their caution was pragmatic. They had seen what happened to rebels. Their lands could be forfeited, their people scattered. The risk was enormous. Those who did join mustered their men, not through coercion alone, though there was that, but through obligation. When the chief called, you came. That was the bond. Some came willingly, eager for a fight. Others came because refusal meant social death. A man who did not muster when called was no longer clan. The Jacobite army, roughly 400 men at the start, moved south. They took Edinburgh without a fight in September. The government army withdrew. For a moment it seemed possible. The Jacobites pushed into England, reaching as far south as Derby, just 125 miles from London. Panic spread in the capital. Then the advance stopped. Charles wanted to push on. His generals insisted on retreat. English Jacobites had not risen. French support, promised, had not materialized. Government armies were closing in from multiple directions. To continue south was to march into a trap. On December 6th, the army turned back. The retreat was brutal. Winter set in. Supplies dwindled. Government forces harried them. Skirmishers bled men. Morale collapsed. By the time they reached the Highlands again, the army was exhausted, underfed, and running out of ammunition. Charles, to his credit, did not abandon them. He stayed. He tried to rally support. He believed, until the very end, that victory was possible. That faith was his greatest weakness. He could not see what was obvious to everyone else. They were going to lose. The final stand came at Culloden. The ground was wrong. The tactics were worse. And the outcome was never in doubt. But the clans came anyway. Because loyalty demanded it. Because honor required it. Because even doomed causes need witnesses. What followed the battle was not defeat. It was annihilation. Culloden Moor, April 16, 1746. Dawn broke cold and wet. The Jacobite army, exhausted from a failed night march, stood on boggy ground. Across the field, government forces under the Duke of Cumberland waited in disciplined lines. The Highlanders charged. Brave, reckless, doomed, they ran into sustained musket fire and grape shot from artillery. Gaps opened in the line. Men fell in clusters. Those who reached the government infantry found bayonets waiting. The battle lasted less than an hour. 1,500 Jacobites dead or dying. Government losses barely broke 100. Cumberland did not accept surrender. His men moved across the field, bayoneting the wounded, shooting anyone who moved. They called it pacification. It was murder. The night before, the Jacobite army attempted a surprise attack on Cumberland's camp at Nairn. The plan was to march 12 miles in darkness and hit the sleeping troops at dawn. It failed. The march took longer than expected. Men stumbled in the dark. Units became separated. By the time they reached Nairn, dawn was approaching. Charles reluctantly ordered a retreat. The army staggered back to Culloden, arriving around dawn. They had marched all night without food. Many collapsed from exhaustion. There was no time to rest. Cumberland's army was already moving. The Jacobites had to form up on ground they had not chosen, in conditions that negated every advantage they possessed. Culloden Moor was flat, open, waterlogged, perfect for disciplined infantry and artillery. Disastrous for Highland tactics, which relied on rapid downhill charges over broken ground. The Jacobite commanders knew this. They argued for retreat to better terrain. Charles, exhausted and desperate, overruled them. They would fight here, today. The two armies faced each other across roughly 500 yards. Government forces numbered about 9,000 Dar. The Jacobites had perhaps 5,000 Dar, many half-starved and barely able to stand. Cumberland's artillery opened fire. Solid shot and grape shot tore into the Jacobite lines. Men fell. Others closed ranks. The bombardment continued for 20 minutes. No answer came from the Jacobite guns, poorly positioned and undermanned. Finally, without orders, the right wing charged. The clans could not stand under fire and do nothing. Charging was what they did. It was their identity. They ran across the moor, screaming, swords raised into a wall of musket fire. The government infantry fired in volleys, 3 ranks rotating so that fire was continuous. Highlanders dropped in rows. Those who reached the government lines found triple-ranked bayonets waiting. Hand-to-hand fighting was brief and one-sided. The charge broke. On the left wing, other clans tried to advance but became tangled in boggy ground. Government cavalry swept around the flanks. Within an hour, the Jacobite army was routed. Survivors fled east and south. The killing continued. Cumberland's orders were explicit: no quarter. His men hunted fugitives into the surrounding countryside. Wounded Jacobites on the field were executed where they lay. A barn holding injured Highlanders was set alight. Those who tried to escape were shot. Bodies were stripped and left for days as warnings. The battle was military. What came after was policy. For weeks, government troops swept the Highlands. They burned homes. They shot livestock. They rounded up anyone suspected of Jacobite sympathies. Trials were formalities. Hangings followed. Cumberland earned the nickname Butcher. Among the English, he was hailed as a hero. Among the Highlands, his name became synonymous with cruelty. He had won. But he had also ensured that reconciliation was impossible. Culloden did not just end a battle. It ended a way of life. The clans would never muster again. The old bonds were severed. And the government, having crushed armed resistance, turned to a more methodical form of destruction. The clans were militarily defeated, but that was not enough. They had to be culturally erased. The disarming acts came first, forbidding Highlanders from carrying weapons. Then the Dress Act, banning tartan and Highland dress. Then laws dissolving the clan structure itself, stripping chiefs of hereditary jurisdiction, turning them from protectors into landlords. The change was deliberate. Chiefs who once held land in trust for the people now held it as private property. And property could be optimized. Sheep were more profitable than people. The first evictions, what would become known as the Highland clearances, began quietly in the 1760s. Families were told to leave. Cottages were burned to ensure they could not return. The dispossessed moved to coastal plots too small to farm or boarded ships for North America, Australia, New Zealand. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1747 was the legal mechanism. It stripped clan chiefs of their traditional powers to hold courts, collect rents according to customary law, and command military service. Overnight, chiefs became landlords in the English sense. They no longer owed protection. They owed nothing but the formalities of contract law. This was not accidental. It was designed to break the clan system by severing its economic and legal foundation. A chief who could not judge disputes, who could not call out his men, who could not redistribute resources according to need, was not a chief. He was simply a landowner, and landowners were expected to maximize profit. Many chiefs resisted at first, but debt and pressure from Edinburgh and London wore them down. The old cattle economy was in decline. Highland estates produced little cash income. Meanwhile, wool prices were rising. Sheep farming could turn barren moors into profitable enterprises. The math was brutal. An estate that supported 500 families through subsistence farming might support only a dozen shepherds but yield 10 times the income. The choice seemed obvious to a chief drowning in debt or seduced by lowland luxury. Clear the people, bring in the sheep. The first clearances were hesitant, localized. Estate factors managers hired to run the land handled the work. Notices were served. Rent arrears were cited as justification. Families were given weeks, sometimes only days, to leave. When they did not leave willingly, force was applied. Cottages were unroofed, rendering them uninhabitable. Belongings were thrown into the mud. Livestock were driven off. In some cases, buildings were burned with families' possessions still inside. The work was done by hired men, often from outside the clan, sometimes by lowlanders who felt no kinship with the dispossessed. Where did they go? Some moved to the coast, where estate owners allocated tiny plots on rocky and fertile ground. The plots were too small to support a family. The intent was to create a labor pool for kelping, the collection and burning of seaweed to produce industrial chemicals. The work was grueling, dangerous, and paid almost nothing. Others emigrated. Ships left from ports like Fort William and Oban, crowded with families carrying whatever they could. The passage was expensive. Many went into debt to pay it. Conditions on board were appalling. Disease spread. Children died. But even that was preferable to staying on land where they had no future. The clearances accelerated through the late 18th and into the 19th century. Entire glens were emptied. The population of the Highlands collapsed. In 1750, the region had held perhaps 300 people. By 1850, that number had been halved, not through natural decline but through forced removal. The government had crushed the clans to eliminate a military threat. The clearances completed the job by removing the people who might have resisted. The land remained, now safely in the hands of compliant landlords who grazed sheep where families had lived for centuries. The people who were cleared saw betrayal. The chiefs, their protectors, had become their destroyers. Songs from the era are bitter, filled with curses. The trust that had held the clan system together for centuries was shattered in a single generation. By 1800, the Highlands were quiet. Gaelic was fading from daily use in many areas. The old songs were forgotten or sung only in secret. Clan structures that had survived centuries dissolved within 2 generations. And then something strange happened. The same English and lowland elites who had crushed the clans began to romanticize them. Walter Scott's novels turned Highlanders into noble savages. Queen Victoria built Balmoral and draped herself in tartan. Suddenly, the culture that had been illegal was fashionable but only as costume, only as past, never as living threat. The monuments went up, cairns at Culloden, statues of clansmen in town squares. But the monuments did not tell the truth. They turned genocide into tragedy, policy into fate. Sir Walter Scott was the architect of Highland romanticism. His novels, beginning with Waverley in 1814, presented the Jacobite clans as tragic heroes. Brave, loyal, doomed by history. His portrayal was sentimental and deeply inaccurate. He erased the violence, the complexity, the internal divisions. He turned a political and cultural conflict into a costume drama. The novels were wildly successful. They created a version of Scotland that appealed to British and European audiences. Noble warriors in kilts, mist-covered glens, ancient castles. This was Scotland as fantasy, safe because it was past. The real Highlands, impoverished and depopulated, were conveniently ignored. In 1822, Scott orchestrated King George IV's visit to Edinburgh. It was the first time a British monarch had visited Scotland in nearly 2 centuries. Scott stage managed the entire event as a Highland spectacle. Clan chiefs appeared in full tartan regalia. The king himself wore a kilt, much to the amusement of onlookers who noted he wore pink tights underneath. The tartan on display was largely invented. Before the ban, tartan patterns had been regional, not clan-specific. The idea that each clan had a unique tartan was mostly a 19th century creation, marketed by textile manufacturers and embraced by chiefs eager to assert status. The whole performance was theatre, but it worked. It established the Highlands as a symbol of Scottish identity, safely neutered and commodified. Queen Victoria took the fantasy further. She fell in love with the Highlands during visits in the 1840s. She and Prince Albert purchased Balmoral and built a castle there in Scots baronial style, festooned with tartan furnishings. Victoria wore tartan. She commissioned tartan designs. She turned Highland culture into a royal fashion statement. This was the culture that had been banned less than a century earlier. Now it was respectable, even aristocratic. But the respectability depended on its being safely dead as a living, breathing, autonomous culture. You could wear tartan, but you could not speak Gaelic in polite company. You could romanticize clansmen, but actual Highlanders remained poor, powerless, and invisible. The monuments followed. In 1881, a cairn was raised at Culloden to mark the graves of the clans. It listed the names of the clans who fought and died, but the inscription was vague. It spoke of bravery and tragedy, not of government policy and deliberate slaughter. The monument memorialized without explaining. This selective memory served a purpose. It allowed Scotland to integrate into the British imperial project without awkward questions. The Highlands became a symbol of romantic nationalism that posed no threat to the British state. Highland regiments, raised from descendants of cleared clansmen, fought and died for the empire. The military valor that had once resisted Britain was now deployed in its service. The forgetting was policy as much as sentiment. School curriculums taught British history, not Scottish. Gaelic was further marginalized. The clearances, when mentioned, were framed as economic inevitability, not deliberate dispossession. The language of progress justified the erasure, and so the Highlands entered the 20th century as a tourist destination, a landscape of picturesque ruins and carefully curated heritage. The stones stood, the stories were buried. Walk through the ruins today, Dunnottar on its cliff above the North Sea, Urquhart on the shore of Loch Ness, Kilchurn beside Loch Orr, the walls still rise. Raven's Nest in the broken towers. Tourists take photographs, but the stones are silent. The great halls where chiefs hosted bards and settled disputes are open to the sky. The spiral stairs lead nowhere. These castles were not abandoned because they were obsolete. They were emptied because the people who gave them meaning were scattered. Some descendants emigrated and prospered. Others died in tenements in Glasgow or starved during the potato famine that hit the Highlands as hard as Ireland. The towers remain as evidence of what was built, of what was destroyed. Dunnottar sits on a narrow promontory jutting into the North Sea south of Aberdeen. Waves hammer the cliffs below. The castle clings to the rock, walls rising directly from the cliff edge. It was besieged multiple times, most famously in 1651 when it held the Scottish crown jewels against Cromwell's army. After the Jacobite risings, it was left to decay. By the 19th century, it was roofless, used as a quarry by locals. Today, you pay admission. Walk across a narrow land bridge. Climb steep steps worn smooth by centuries. The courtyard is grass now. Wildflowers push through cracks. The great hall has no roof. Stand inside and look up at sky where carved beams once held slate. Interpretive signs explain the history. They do not mention that the earl who owned it was complicit in the clearances, that tenants were evicted so he could expand sheep runs. Urquhart on Loch Ness tells a similar story. The castle controlled a strategic position on the Great Glen. After Culloden, it was partially demolished by government troops to prevent Jacobite use. The gatehouse tower still stands. The rest is rubble, low walls marking where buildings once stood. Tour buses arrive daily. Visitors take photographs, buy souvenirs. Few ask why the castle is ruined. The answer: it was deliberately destroyed as part of pacification is available, but not emphasized. The focus is on the picturesque, the romantic. Kilchurn, at the head of Loch Orr, is harder to reach. You walk a mile from the nearest road. The castle rises from a peninsula, surrounded on three sides by water. It belonged to the Campbells, a clan that sided with the government and profited. Kilchurn was abandoned in the 1760s because the chief built a more comfortable house elsewhere. It was left to rain and wind. The tower still stands, 5 stories of stone. You can climb the spiral stair carefully. From the top, the view is staggering. Mountains rise on all sides. The loch stretches silver. It is beautiful and melancholy, a monument to something that cannot be recovered. These ruins are curated now. Historic Environment Scotland manages them. They are maintained, kept accessible for tourists. But the curation is selective. Architecture is explained. Battles recounted. The people who lived in these castles, who worked in them, who were driven from the lands around them, remain invisible. The towers stand as witnesses to resilience and loss. The stone endure. The culture it housed does not. That gap is the real story these ruins tell. You can visit them. You can climb the stairs, stand in the halls, imagine what they were. But imagination is all that is left. The voices are gone. The language is nearly gone. What remains is scenic, educational, and profoundly empty. The clans did not disappear. They fractured. Today, millions of people worldwide claim Highland ancestry. Clan societies meet. Tartans are registered. Genealogists trace lines back through parish records and shipping manifests. But the connection is thin. Language is gone for most. The land is owned by estates and sporting syndicates. The social structure that made a clan kinship obligation, mutual protection, shared land exists only in memory and imagination. DNA tests cannot restore what was lost. Wearing a tartan cannot rebuild a culture. The past is claimed, performed, marketed, but it is not lived. And that gap between heritage and history is where the truth hides. The genealogy industry thrives on Highland ancestry. Companies offer DNA tests promising to connect you to your roots. People frame the certificates. They buy clan crests. They attend Highland games in North America, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere the diaspora settled. The Highland games are curious. Invented in the 19th century, they feature Highland dancing, bagpipe playing, caber tossing. Participants wear kilts in clan tartans. The atmosphere is festive, nostalgic. But what is being remembered? Not the language. Most speak only English. Not the social structures. What is being remembered is an aesthetic. Tartan, bagpipes, misty mountains. The image Walter Scott and Queen Victoria created. The games are sincere, but what participants connect to is not historical clan life. It is a memory, distorted through generations. Genealogists trace lines with skill. Parish registers and emigration manifests provide data. You can follow a surname from a glen to a ship to Nova Scotia. But what does that tree tell you? Names, dates, places. The records do not capture what it meant to be part of a clan. The obligations, the identity, the belonging, those are lost. DNA testing adds another layer. It can tell you your ancestors came from the Highlands. It cannot tell you which clan because membership was not always genetic. Clans adopted members. They absorbed smaller families. They extended kinship fictively. Bloodlines mattered, but not exclusively. The land itself is the starkest reminder of disconnection. The glens are largely empty. The population never recovered. Villages are dominated by retirees and tourists. The land is owned by estates held by absentee landlords who use it for sporting. Land that once supported thousands now supports a handful of workers. There have been efforts to reclaim land. The community land movement has seen townships buy out landlords. Small victories showing connection to place still matters. Yet for most, the connection is nostalgic, not lived. You can visit as a tourist. You can stand in the glen your ancestors were cleared from. But you cannot return meaningfully. The culture that would have received you is gone. The language is gone. The community is gone. Heritage is not history. Heritage is what we choose to remember. History is what happened. The diaspora has built a heritage of tartans and romantic landscapes. But the history is clearances, language death, forced emigration, erasure. Both are true. Both matter, but they are not the same. Scotland is not innocent in this story. Lowland Scots were often the enforcers. They profited from cleared land. They filled ranks in the regiments that burned cottages. They wrote the laws that banned Gaelic. The narrative of English oppression is real but incomplete. This was also Scottish oppression of Scots, class and culture weaponized, elites consolidating power by erasing rivals. The reckoning with that complicity is slow and incomplete. Statues stand. Street names honor men who ordered clearances. Schools teach a sanitized version where Culloden is a sad battle and the clans are romantic ghosts, not victims of deliberate policy. Truth-telling is hard when it implicates your own ancestors. Edinburgh was never Highland. It was a lowland city, English-speaking, commercially oriented, allied with England long before 1707. Lowland Scots viewed Highlanders with fear, contempt, and fascination. They were useful as soldiers but dangerous if not controlled. The solution was to anglicize them, and Lowlanders were active participants. The lawyers who drafted the laws were Scots. The factors who carried out evictions were Scots. The soldiers who burned cottages came from lowland regiments. The ministers who preached against Gaelic were Scots. Some grew rich from the clearances. They purchased cleared estates, ran sheep farms, invested in industries that extracted value from the Highlands while providing minimal benefit to those who remained. This is uncomfortable history. Scottish nationalism often frames Scotland as a victim of English imperialism, and there is truth in that. But Scotland was also an active participant in British imperialism. Highland regiments fought across the empire. And within Scotland, the Lowlands colonized the Highlands with methods not unlike those the British used in Ireland or India. The reckoning is ongoing and contentious. In recent decades, efforts have emerged to teach a more honest version. Some schools cover the topic in detail. Museums have mounted exhibitions, but resistance remains. Some descendants of estate owners bristle at the term clearances, preferring improvements. Some argue emigration offered opportunity. These arguments obscure the violence involved. Monuments to the clearances are rare. In 2007, a memorial was unveiled in Helmsdale near the harbour where ships departed for North America. The inscription acknowledges loss, but stops short of naming responsibility. Compare that to monuments to clan chiefs and Jacobite heroes everywhere, prominent, heroic. Street names in Highland towns honour the men who cleared them. The Duke of Sutherland, whose estates saw brutal clearances, has monuments named for him. Gaelic revitalization efforts are another site of reckoning. The language nearly died. By the 1970s, fewer than 70 0 spoke it. Since then, government support and activism have stabilized numbers. Gaelic medium schools exist. BBC Alba broadcasts in Gaelic. Road signs are bilingual. These efforts acknowledge that loss was not natural or inevitable. But Gaelic remains a minority language, spoken by less than 2% of the population. The question Scotland faces is how to remember honestly without becoming paralyzed by guilt. That means teaching the full history. It means supporting the communities and cultures that survived. It means recognizing that victimhood and complicity can coexist in the same national story. Scotland is slowly doing this work, but it is slow, contested, and incomplete. The past shapes the present, and how Scotland chooses to remember will determine what kind of future it builds. The towers do not speak, but they witness. They witness that cultures can be erased, that governments commit atrocities and call them policy, that beauty and violence occupy the same ground. That what seems permanent language, law, ways of life can be dismantled within a generation if power wills it. The clans are gone. Their descendants remain, scattered, some thriving, some still carrying the wound. The lesson is not that the past can be undone. It cannot. The lesson is that forgetting serves power. Remembering disrupts it. Every burned cottage, every banned word, every cleared glen was a choice. And choices can be examined, named, and judged. Stand at Culloden today. Flags mark the positions of the armies. You can walk the moor where the clans charged. Headstones mark the mass graves, simple stones with clan names carved into them. But the site offers something else: honesty. The exhibits do not flinch from describing what happened after the battle, the executions, the burnings, the deliberate policy of suppression. This is what truth-telling looks like. Not comfortable, not sentimental, not romantic. The parallels to other cultural erasures are unavoidable. Indigenous peoples in North America, Australia, New Zealand faced similar campaigns. Residential schools, forced assimilation, language bans. The Highland clearances are part of that pattern, well-documented evidence of how states destroy cultures they find inconvenient. What can the towers teach us? First, that heritage is political. What gets remembered and how shapes the present. The romanticization of the clans in the 19th century served British nationalism. It allowed Scotland to be symbolically distinct while being politically integrated. That selective memory was useful to power. Second, that cultures are fragile. They seem durable when you live inside them. Language, custom, law all feel permanent, but they are sustained by practice. Stop speaking the language for a generation and it dies. Break the transmission from old to young, and within decades almost nothing remains. Third, that beauty is not innocence. The towers are beautiful. The glens are stunning. But beauty does not erase what happened. It can coexist with violence, even be used to obscure it. Romantic tourism profits from Highland beauty while erasing Highland suffering. Finally, that memory is a choice. We choose what to remember and how. We can choose stories that comfort or stories that challenge. Scotland is choosing, slowly, to remember more honestly. The towers help. They stand as evidence that cannot be edited. Walk through them and you feel the absence. The empty halls, the missing roofs, the silence. That absence is the story. The clans will not return. The culture cannot be fully restored, but it can be remembered truthfully. And that truth offers something valuable, the knowledge that what happened was not inevitable. It was chosen. And because it was chosen, it can be judged. And in judging it, we might learn to recognize similar patterns before they complete their work. The towers remember. The question is whether we will listen.